Hi, it's Emma here with another Roobydoo Art Class, and today we will be creating a black and white chalk and charcoal drawing inspired by the photographer Carl Blossfeldt. We'll be looking at how we can create lovely light tones and really lovely deep dark shadows to create a dramatic effect. For this project you will need some white paper or a sketchbook, pencil, rubber and sharpener to draw with, and then an A3 piece of either neutral or grey pastel paper, and some white and black chalk or charcoal. You can use willow charcoal or compressed charcoal for this project, whichever you have to hand. So I always like to start a project by having a practice sketch first. So you can see here I have one of Carl Blossfeldt's photographs, and I've used my pencil to draw a line around the perimeter of the leaf shape so that I can get more of a clear idea of the general shape of the leaf before I sketch it onto my paper. So you can see how I've transferred it onto the paper here. I've started with a vertical line down the centre to help me to keep my leaf symmetrical, and then I've copied that outer perimeter line. Now I'm starting to look at where the leaf branches off from the central vein of the leaf, and I can see that they go up at 45-degree angles from the main spine. And I've also noticed that the first set of leaves are coming off roughly halfway down the leaf itself. So if I make a mark roughly halfway down my basic sketch, I can start to put those main structural lines in. Now if I look at the bottom half of the leaf, I notice that roughly halfway down again is where those lower sections are branching off to. So if I look at my drawing, halfway down, I can pop those guidelines in. Again, these can be changed at a later date if needs be. They're just to help us to get the basic structure. Now I'm starting to look at the outer edge of the leaf shapes, and I'm going to be looking at it section by section. And sometimes when you're drawing something like this, it helps to take it bit by bit. And I'm also looking at the negative space. So that means the space around the shape. So I'm looking at the shape that is created by the background around the outline of the leaf itself. And that will help me when I start to sketch it, and it helps me to check whether things are roughly the right shape or size. Sometimes it's good to just draw in chunks and simplify the shapes first. So here I am drawing in a very chunky geometric way with squares, rectangles, straight lines, just to help me to map everything out before I then go back in and chip away at some of that finer detail. So I always like to practice my drawing on a piece of white paper first. So even though I know I'm going to be eventually doing this on the pastel paper, by sketching it first in my sketchbook or on a piece of cartridge paper, it just gets me looking really closely at the sizes of things, the shapes of things, the proportions, and thinking about how they are all going to work together as an overall shape and design. I'm going to start going back into this now with a little bit more detail, starting to really sort of shape and chip away at some of those details around the outsides of the leaves, and you can do as much or a little as that as you want to before you decide you're ready to go onto your charcoal. So I feel like I've got a good idea of what I'm doing now, and so I've got my grey paper and I'm going to start sketching the leaf onto the grey paper, and you can see that I've made some small dots to just give me an idea of where I want the top and the bottom and the two widest parts at the side to be. So because I've already drawn this once on the white paper, I've got a good feel now for the shapes that I want to create. So I'm just going to go straight in there and draw the outline shape of the leaf. But I'm going to use quite light marks with my chalk because I might not necessarily want these to show up in the final drawing. So I'm using very sketchy marks at first. You can rub these and smudge these out if you want to change them as you go along. It's not really going to affect the overall final piece, but I just like to keep it as light and as sketchy as possible. You can see there I've just redrawn a little bit. So the lighter it is, the easier it is to go back and change things if you need to, and add things on, make them bigger, make them smaller, etc. So I call this a lost and found line because it's a line that looks like it's a little bit broken, it disappears in places, and so I call it a lost and found line, and it's great for when you're sketching out ideas. Now I'm starting to think now about some light and shade in the leaf. So if you look at the photo closely, and we start to look at where the lightest areas are and where the darkest areas are. And so I'm going to do the lightest areas first. So all down the left hand side of that main spine of the leaf, or the central vein of that leaf, is quite light. So I'm using a lovely flat edge of the chalk there to just rub it gently over the paper to leave some nice chalk dust that I can then just move around gently with my finger. Now if I look on the right hand side of the leaf, you can see that the flat part of the leaf as it's going out towards the edge is quite light, and so I'm now just moving my eye around the picture, just looking really for where are the lightest bits that I can just start to block in. I'm not too worried about detail at this point. I'm not even too concerned about the accuracy of the drawing because accuracy of the drawing, sort of making it look like a photographic representation, is not always the aim. You know, we just want it to look like a leaf. We want it to look naturalistic and slightly realistic. So here I'm looking at the light and dark. As you can see, the background on the left hand side is very light, and on the right hand side there is a shadow that's being cast, and the leaf itself is actually lighter than the background on the right hand side just there where I'm pointing. So I'm going to make sure that I keep that in mind when I'm shading. So on this left hand side now here, which I spotted was much darker, this is where I can now start to go in there with some of the black charcoal. Now like I was saying before, you can use either willow charcoal or compressed charcoal. For this I'm using willow charcoal. So willow charcoal leaves a much darker mark on the paper, but it does easily smudge and spread out, which is good. But also, if you're wanting to keep a very, very dark mark that doesn't smudge, you might want to use compressed charcoal. You get a much more defined line with the compressed charcoal. The compressed charcoal tends to look a lot like, if you've not used it before, it will look like a stick of chalk. It's quite solid, it's quite dense. It'll look like a cylinder shape or a square shape. The willow charcoal is much thinner and it's very, very lightweight. So that's how you can tell the difference. So here you can see that I am accentuating the vein of the leaf by leaving it nice and light and then just putting in the shadows either side of it to lift that part of the leaf. And this is what we call the messy stage. It looks very sort of, it's in bits. You might start to think, is it ever going to come together? How's this ever going to look like a leaf? But you do have to sort of just trust the process and keep looking at where you can pick out some lovely juicy dark areas and some really beautiful bright light areas, and you can keep swapping and changing back from the white to the black to the white to the black, just building up each part of the leaf bit by bit. I would be careful not to over smudge. So sometimes we can be tempted to smudge everything because it can be a really lovely effect. But if everything is smudged, then everything will look blurry. And just like a photograph, you know, a photograph where everything is blurry is not going to be very eye-catching. But with some blur and some more crisp edges, it makes it much more interesting. You'll notice now that as well as large chunks of shadow, I'm actually starting to look at small detail now. So tiny little areas on the edges of the leaf or down the central spine where I can start to just add those small bits of detail that really start to bring the drawing to life. And I'm swapping and changing between the white chalk and the black charcoal to start to just build it up bit by bit, piece by piece. And I'm just looking really quickly back and forth at the photograph and then back to my drawing and seeing which areas need more work, which areas perhaps need changing slightly, where I can build up tone or where I can make highlights pop even more. I'm thinking really carefully about which areas I want to smudge and which areas I don't. And the great thing about chalk and charcoal is that you can redraw over things as well. So you can give it a smudge with your finger. In effect, it rubs it out. Leaves a little bit of a residue behind, but that's okay. It sort of adds to the overall look of it. And then you can redraw back over the top. So it's really nice material to use. It's quite forgiving in that respect. Now the advantage to using a grey background is that a lot of our mid-tones are already created for us. So you'll see that some of the medium shades of grey are already built in there. And that's the great advantage of using a mid-toned paper rather than a bright white paper or even a black paper. It's worth experimenting on all those different types of backgrounds for sure. And also looking at paler greys and even textured papers, handmade papers, or even creating a collage background first of all to work on top of. It's worth experimenting with different types of papers. This is a pastel paper, specific pastel paper, which means it has a slight texture on it, a little bit of a tooth, so that it will hold on to those particles of the chalk and the charcoal quite nicely. You'll notice that if you try and use chalk or charcoal on a paper that's too smooth, it just doesn't like it. It doesn't sit on there very well. So now I'm just checking out my photo again and I'm looking at the background, and you'll notice that the background is a lot paler than the leaf itself on the left hand side, and so I'm taking the white chalk here and I'm just rolling it on its side just into those areas in between the leaf. And again, you can decide, do you want to smudge it, do you not want to smudge it? I quite like the texture that the tooth of the paper is creating, but by all means experiment, you know, and see what you prefer. So I hope this video has been useful, and I really hope it's inspired you to have a go with this really versatile material. If you do have a go, I would love to see some photos of your finished pieces, and thank you so much for watching the video.